So in this lecture, we're going to be complicating Wonder Woman. And what I mean by that is often there's kind of a very rather simple narrative told about Wonder Woman. And I want to just make it more complex, show how there's other things going on. And this will both help us to think about what happens after Wonder Woman with the comics code and things like that. But also in so doing and looking this more deeply, it will also help you to think about your paper and to analyze things a little bit more deeply. So one thing, first of all, we have to talk about is the issue of confirmation bias, which is favoring evidence that supports your pre-existing beliefs while ignoring evidence that doesn't. And I like this, I did 6 experiments, but only 1 supported our hypothesis. Well, let's only submit that experiment to the grant proposal. What about the other 5? Well, those were just human error. The idea being that we human beings, we want to find evidence that supports and confirms what we already believe. And that's just what human beings do. And in a history course in particular, we have to learn to think about lots of different kinds of evidence, especially evidence that challenges us. And typically what people do is we like to think anachronistically. That is, we like to take ideas that we have now and find support for them in the past, even if that means missing out some important things about how those people in the past think or acted differently than us. And I think that happens a lot with Wonder Woman. So I think she's a great example to help us be on the lookout for confirmation bias. So then we can both better write better papers, but also understand the past and the world that has shaped that we live in today better. So you could consider Wonder Woman a kind of feminist icon, I think, right? For many feminists, she represents a very powerful woman. And that makes a lot of sense. And I want to point out that the imagery associated with Wonder Woman here, you could see in earlier images. This is from 1912, and this is a cartoon calling for women's suffrage. And the idea is that this woman wants to be liberated from these bonds that say politics is not the place of women, and then so she can go out and vote and take a role in politics and not simply in the home. That's kind of the idea. And here you have a kind of similar type of image with Wonder Woman. And so, like I said, she's often seen as a feminist icon. But then this creates kind of an issue. What is feminism, right? How do we define it? And you can kind of see, if we look at what the bonds that she's breaking, I think women, or I shouldn't say women, I'm sorry, feminists would agree that, the idea of male superiority, that is something that should be ended. And I remember hearing one professor say, my definition of feminism is this idea that women are equal and men are equal. Okay, I think that's something that most women most people who identify as feminist would say. And now I could go back, by the way, and delete that I keep saying women instead of just people. But I'm going to leave that in because perhaps that says something, and that goes to the whole kind of text subtext thing, perhaps. But in any case, I'm going to leave that in. But what about this thing here, prudery? What does that mean, right? And that, as we'll see, coming from Marston, the man who creates Wonder Woman, though with the help of his wife and some others, his understanding of prudery it seems be fairly broad. Like, he would consider a lot of sexual attitudes people have even today as prudery, and a lot of feminists would disagree with that. Would say, well, wait a second, I believe in monogamy. Marston did not believe in monogamy, right? So, this creates a problem because some feminists would say, what you're calling prudery is something I think is important. I think monogamy is important. Whereas other feminists would say, no, monogamy is kind of old-fashioned. It's not necessary. It kind of limits women's freedom. Prejudice, in the documentary about Wonder Woman, there you'll have seen that there are some images that are racist, right? There's some images there that we would be very uncomfortable with today. So, and I think most feminists would reject, right? So my point here is, again, just to kind of complement things. What do all these things mean, right? And then this other question is, how do we navigate the tension between equality and difference? And that's a theme that I think Marston raises some interesting questions about. So what do I mean by that? If we say everyone is equal, does that mean that they're the same? And I think our initial reaction is say, no, we're all different, but we're all equal. And that creates some problems, right? Because the whole idea of saying, well, say a woman's place is in the home is based on the idea of difference, right? For someone who views that. But then so a lot of times, you want to emphasize equality. You want to try and play down difference because that can be used to exclude people. But at the same time, are people really comfortable saying men and women, or other gender kind of identities? Are we really comfortable saying that they're all the same? Right? So there's this kind of tension, right? We want to emphasize equality, but we also want to emphasize that people, in a sense, have a right to be different. But the problem is, if differences are significant, isn't that a challenge to equality? Right? If this group or these people who identify in this way are really good at something, doesn't that mean that that's what they should do? Right? So if women are more loving than men, and we'll get to why I'm talking about this momentarily, if women are more loving than men, then doesn't that create a specific role that they should follow? Right? So again, I'm just trying to complicate things. I'm not trying to answer these questions. I'm simply trying to raise them so you can think more deeply. Now, continuing on, one thing we have to understand when reading a text, such as a Wonder Woman comic, is that there's a text, there's what is actually being said, and there's a subtext beneath it. So the text is just what's being said. The subtext, though, are things that are implied. Perhaps something is missing, and the very fact that it is missing says something. That you can especially see things in subtext when you have like artists who are being forced to create art that they don't like. So, for example, if you look at some of the Japanese propaganda posters from World War II, they were being produced by artists who didn't really want to produce them. So sometimes they kept like hidden messages and things like that there. But to give you an example of text versus subtext from animation, you maybe are familiar with the cartoon Sailor Moon. And there's a comic called, an animation episode of Sailor Moon called Computer School Blues. And in this comic, or this cartoon, Serena, pictured here, is constantly berated by both her mother and her cat, if you haven't seen Sailor Moon, the cats talk, for not doing her homework. Right? She's criticized for that. She's berated for that. She's told, you need to do your homework. And if this isn't important enough, or if this isn't emphasized enough, at the very end, she herself gives a speech about how it's important to do your homework. That's the text. Right? In the cartoon, it tells you explicitly in what the characters say, do your homework. Do your homework. Be a good, diligent student and do your homework. But there's a subtext. Because in this episode, the reason it's called Computer School Blues is that there's all these kids, these middle school students, I believe Serena's in middle school, they are going to after school, cram school, to learn computing. And in Japanese education, you have after school. So imagine how tough that is. You're like, oh, I finally get to go be done with school. Now I get to go have more school. Yay. And what happens is going to the school, which has been taken over by these like villains from what's called the Negaverse, they have like a brainwashing program in the computers that transform the students into zombies. So that's a subtext, right? The text is be a good student, do your work, right? Be a good student, do your work. That's what you should be doing. But then there's a subtext that implies that's going to make you a zombie. That's going to make you lose your mind. Someone else is going to take you over. Now, was that intentional? I don't know. But there is something interesting there, right? That in a cartoon that has supposedly it's his message, you should study hard. And in a society where that's emphasized, that there would also be this connection that, yeah, going to school saps your creativity. It makes you a zombie. So I think that was maybe something that the people who wrote this kind of slipped in there, and that my guess is a lot of kids would get. But that's kind of a text and subtext. To give you a couple more examples, this is a little bit different. So one thing we also have to be sure to differentiate, this is very important when you're analyzing, that there's the intent of a text, right? There's an author's intent. An author often has a specific purpose when writing a text. And then there's how the text is actually received, right? So it's the intent of the text. The author wants to do something. And then there's how the text is received. So let me give you an example. J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Author of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and all that. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I've not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people who read Lord of the Rings are not Catholic. A lot of people are secular who read Lord of the Rings. A lot of people who read Lord of the Rings are anti-religious and may point out that in the Lord of the Rings, you have all these heroes, you have people who are moral with no overt religion. And so actually turn it on its head and argue, see, this is proof that you could be a moral person and have a moral society without religion. That was not J.R.R. Tolkien's intent. I say this guy was an extraordinarily devout Catholic, and it totally shaped his work. But the audience is free to receive the text however they want to. And I don't mean free. I mean, I could disagree with this and say you're missing the point, but it doesn't matter. I can't stop them from receiving and reading the text the way they want to. Once it's there, people can read it how they want. And just to give you another example, a friend of mine was like, I love The Lord of the Rings, but I hate the Hobbits. And I don't mean he didn't like the story of the Hobbit. I mean, he hated all the Hobbits. And I'm like, so you hate the point, right? A major part of The Lord of the Rings is this idea that only the Hobbits, the most humble of creatures, are the ones who can be trusted with the ring of power. That's kind of the idea. So he loved the stories except the point. He has that freedom to do so. To give you just one other quick example, The Collector. This is a novel that it's really a weird novel, but it's about a man who wins the lottery, uses it to buy a house, and then stalk a woman, kidnap her, and keep her in his house. And it is a very difficult novel. I read this novel, and it's one of those things I'm glad I read it, but I never want to read the thing again. Because there's a lot of depth to it, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically it's this kind of exploration of this man's psyche. It looks at class differences between him and the poor woman he kidnaps. But the idea when you read this novel, the guy who kidnaps the woman is not the hero. He's a terrible person. And this is not presented in an erotic way at all. This is terrible, right? Like I said, reading this novel is like being punched in the stomach. You know, you're not going to read this. The author's intent is not that you would imitate this guy. The author's intent would be like, no, this guy's terrible. You don't want to be like him, right? This is a terrible person. If you find yourself thinking the way this guy does, you should stay away. So, for example, there's this interesting thing where the guy has these fantasies of rescuing this woman, like she's in danger, and then he has these fantasies of rescuing her. But then they flip. And the fantasy turns to him kidnapping her so he can have her. So the key thing is here, it's presented as, you don't want to be like this guy. This guy's a bad guy. You don't want to be like this guy. This novel has inspired serial killers. And so I want to stress, right? People read this thing and completely missed the point, right? A large part of the point is this is a bad man. This guy is icky. He's creepy, right? Like, sometimes people talk about like the allure of evil, like evil can be kind of cool. No way is this guy cool. A guy's terrible, right? You don't want to be like this guy. But people still miss the point, right? People still miss the point. And that's something you have to think deeply about when you read comics or any kind of text. And later on, when we talk about the efforts to censor comics, because people who tended, I think, to argue that comics should not be censored focused on intent, and people who argued that they should be censored focused on reception, right? And that's very important, right? And we need to consider both. What was the intent of the text, and how it was received.